Breaking news tonight, a Central New York nonprofit that helps survivors of domestic and sexual abuse hired and employed a registered sex offender for the past 2 years. New tonight, Vera House in Syracuse is responding to community concerns brought to the attention of NBC3. This is the man in question, Marcus Jackson. Vera House tells us Jackson was fired last week. In New York, Jackson is a level 2 registered sex offender. Level 3 offenders are the most dangerous. He was convicted of unlawful sexual activity with 15 and 16-year-old boys. Just last month, we profiled Jackson and his role with Vera House.
As spiritual leaders, right, we feel that we need to be present for our people in non-traditional ways. We may not have all the answers, but sometimes folk don't want you to say anything. They just need someone to listen.
Jackson, who is also a pastor, was part of the clergy emergency response team in Syracuse, too. He and others would be some of the first people on scene after violence in the city of Syracuse, often families of young victims of gun violence. Vera House hired Jackson in October of 2020. Investigative reporter Mary Keeler went to the co-executive director of Vera House to ask why. Mary?
Megan, tonight the organization's leaders tell me they knew about Jackson's criminal history before they hired him. And just hours ago, I went to Vera House to ask them why they would knowingly hire a registered sex offender for a role that has him dealing directly with victims of sexual and domestic violence. From October 2020 until the 1st of this month, Marcus Jackson worked at Vera House. Did he approach Vera House? Did Vera House approach him? And then what was the vetting process?
Marcus applied for a position to be an advocate here at Vera House. So he came to us in the applicant pool that we had at that period of time. Co-executive director Randy Bregman says Jackson was honest about his criminal past to hiring managers. The state's Division of Criminal Justice lists Jackson as a level 2 sex offender. It states he was convicted in 2000 for crimes committed in 1998. His victims were 15 and 16-year-old boys. When did you yourself learn that he is a registered sex offender? Our hiring managers were very interested in bringing him on to Vera House, but recognized that there was the sex offense history. They didn't have that experience in the past, so they came and asked if there would be a reason that we could not hire him. So we did a little bit of research and found that there were some positions that we wouldn't be able to hire him for. And we knew that we didn't want him working with people who were underage.
Was that at all concerning to you?
No, I think what was concerning to us would be if we did a background check and something came back that was more recent or that he hadn't told us about.
Despite Jackson telling us last month his role impacted the lives of young people, Bregman claims the victims he worked with were all over 18 and that any contact with minors was in his volunteer capacity with the clergy emergency response team. The victims he worked with at Vera House were dealing with trauma after sexual, domestic, and other types of abuse.
We believe in the capacity for people to change. And we hold values simultaneously, which I think is often hard for people to do. We value the safety of all victims and survivors and potential victims. At the same time, we value the humanity of everyone, including somebody who may have committed harm.
And in response to people can change, how do you juxtapose that advice to advice you would give a victim who is escaping or trying to escape a cycle of abuse?
Actually, it might surprise you to hear, Mary, but I wouldn't advise somebody that people can never change.
Our story on July 15th led to a viewer calling us Monday very concerned about Jackson's role with Vera House given his sex offender status. Vera House heard concerns too after that story and decided to terminate his employment. Bregman says there's no policy at Vera House that prevents sex offenders from getting hired. You stand by Vera House's decision ultimately to hire Marcus Jackson.
I do, and I think that we would make a similar decision again if somebody came to us, acknowledged a 20-year-old sex offense.
There are still the optics of it, especially in this very sensitive line of work.
I appreciate that, and I will say Vera House tries not to make decisions based on optics, but we try and make decisions based on our values.
It's estimated that Jackson made about $40,000 a year in that position at Vera House, and that pilot program he was the sole employee of used funding from the State Office of Victim Services. Vera House welcomes anyone with concerns about Jackson's former employment with them to give them a call. Live in Syracuse tonight, I'm Mary Keeler.
Yeah, really incredible reporting, Mary. We appreciate that. Any word from Jackson himself tonight?
No word from Jackson himself, but we do know that Randy Bregman from Vera House, she did say that she talked to him as early or as recently as yesterday. He's looking for more employment, she said, after ending his employment with Vera House.
We're continuing to dig into the story we broke yesterday of Vera House knowingly employing a level 2 sex offender to work with victims of abuse. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Hall.
And I'm Megan Coleman. The nonprofit told Pastor Marcus Jackson disclosed his status prior to hiring and that they stand by their decision despite parting ways with Jackson earlier this month. Vera House's co-executive director Randy Bregman explained the rationale by saying in part Jackson's crime was from 20 years ago.
No, I think what was concerning to us would be if we did a background check and something came back that was more recent or that he hadn't told us about.
Now, that was last night. Investigative reporter Mary Keeler learned Jackson was arrested in 2016, just 4 years prior to his job starting at Vera House. She's looking into that arrest for us tonight.
The Marion County Sheriff's Office in Florida arrested Marcus Jackson in March 2016. The Public Information Office provided us this arrest report detailing Jackson's failure to register as required. Documents we've obtained show in April of 2000, Jackson was convicted in Florida of, quote, unlawful sexual activity with certain minors. That required Jackson to register as a sex offender for life. The arrest report notes that Jackson signed a form indicating he understood what he needed to do as a registered sex offender in the state. According to Florida authorities, Jackson registered with Syracuse police in June of 2013. He gave them a permanent address in Syracuse to put on file and was required to notify the New York State Department of Criminal Justice of any change in address if he moved within 10 days. Marion County Sheriff's documents show they were tipped off in 2016 that Jackson was actually living in Florida and working as a pastor at a church. So they contacted Syracuse police and asked for an address check. Syracuse police found Jackson had been evicted from his home in November of 2015. Police say Jackson was arrested in Marion County in March of 2016 and told police he had moved there right before his mom passed in November and that he searched online and did not see requirements for registering in Florida. He told police he made a mistake. Marcus Jackson was arrested for failure to comply with the rules as a sex offender, and a spokesperson for Marion County confirms he spent March to September of 2016 at the Marion County Jail. Randy Bregman of Vera House told me in an email that Jackson disclosed this in his initial interview, and they accepted his explanation. In that same email, Bregman said she stands by her earlier statement that, quote, we do not regret hiring Marcus. She said our July 15th piece on Marcus's work prompted a new discussion on his role with Vera House.
There was a reaction, I would say, to his interview that prompted some people to raise questions and push in. And we came to a mutual understanding with Marcus that for the interest of himself and the work he wanted to do and the interest of Vera House, that it made sense for us to have an agreeable separation at that time. But would we have released him from employment because of something from 20 years ago that we knew about? No, we would not.
I got in contact with Jackson this afternoon, but he wasn't interested in speaking with us at this point.
Tonight, an in-depth look at this week's CNY Central investigation that led some of you to write to us that you feel betrayed, hurt, and incredibly angry. This involves the Syracuse nonprofit agency Vera House, which is committed to helping men, women, and children who are victims of sexual and domestic abuse. An organization that 2 years ago knowingly hired a registered sex offender to counsel some of these victims. What you're about to see now is CBS 5 News investigative reporter Mary Keeler asking Vera House co-executive director Randy Bregman a very important question that is the foundation of all the reporting we've done this week.
When did you yourself learn that he is a registered sex offender?
Our hiring managers were very interested in bringing him on to Vera House, but recognized that there was the sex offense history. They didn't have that experience in the past, so they came and asked if there would be a reason that we could not hire him.
Was that at all concerning to you?
No, I think what was concerning to us would be if we did a background check and something came back that was more recent or that he hadn't told us about.
We'll come back to that explanation in a moment. That interview with Randy Bregman left our investigative team with more questions, and we found answers to many of them. 58-year-old Marcus Jackson is a central figure here. He was convicted and served prison time in Florida for sex crimes he committed against 2 teenage boys in 1998. Jackson spent about 3 years in prison, and as part of his sentence, he was required for the rest of his life to remain a registered Level 2 sex offender. You may be familiar with sex offender designations, a level system in place, 1, 2, or 3. Level 3 sex offenders are considered the most dangerous, the most likely to reoffend. Jackson is designated a Level 2 offender. Signed documents when he was released from prison that confirm that he understands the expectations, that registering means he has to keep an up-to-date address on file for where he lives, and that needs to be filed with the state and the police department where he's living. Jackson didn't do that. Our investigation took us to Florida this week, where after sending just one email, we received a detailed report explaining why Jackson was convicted of failing to comply with that state's sex offender registration requirements in 2016. Over 2 pages, the investigating deputy described how Jackson became known as Pastor Marcus Jackson and was working with churches in Florida and also in New York. We learned that addresses he gave to New York State and to Syracuse police were out of date at best. One address he was evicted from, yet remained on file as his home. For this crime, Pastor Marcus Jackson was arrested and spent 6 months in jail. Imprisoned for sex crimes in the late 1990s and jailed for failing to tell police where he was living as recently as 2016. That was 4 years before Vera House hired him. Vera House's leader tells us Jackson told the agency about that jail sentence, but Vera House never saw the court paperwork that we obtained with one email until we presented it to the agency. Listen to the explanation from Vera House's leader again.
Was that at all concerning to you?
No, I think what was concerning to us would be if we did a background check and something came back that was more recent or that he hadn't told us about. We believe in the capacity for people to change, and we hold values simultaneously, which I think is often hard for people to do. We value the safety of all victims and survivors and potential victims. At the same time, we value the humanity of everyone, including somebody who may have committed harm.
There are still the optics of it, especially in this very sensitive line of work.
I appreciate that, and I will say, Vera House tries not to make decisions based on optics, but we try and make decisions based on our values.
Last month, CBS 5 did a profile news story on Pastor Marcus Jackson's work at Vera House as part of a pilot program responding to Syracuse street violence. Not long after, Vera House began to field questions and concerns from others in the community who saw that news report. Then, Vera House changed course. Despite defending the decision to hire Jackson throughout our interview, we were told that Jackson and Vera House came to a mutual agreement to part ways effective August 1st. Despite this straightforward answer to a straightforward question.
You stand by Vera House's decision ultimately to hire Marcus Jackson.
I do, and I think that we would make a similar decision again if somebody came to us, acknowledged a 20-year-old sex offense.
Vera House on Thursday announced its policy is changing. The organization will not hire sex offenders in the future. Mary Keeler's investigation and tips from the community helped us learn that on July 31st, the day before he officially left Vera House, Jackson was arrested again, this time by police in Manlius. The criminal complaint accuses him of a number of crimes related to breaking into businesses, allegedly trying to steal copper. He was also accused of driving an unregistered, uninsured vehicle with no license. By chance, our Mary Keeler was at the Manlius Police Department gathering information on this when Pastor Jackson showed up to get the car.
We would just like to hear from you.
Absolutely nothing to say to you. Please step away from me.
That was the second time Mary approached Pastor Jackson for comment. We continue to welcome him to tell his side of the story to us. Meantime, others are having their say. A woman who does sensitive work with young victims of abuse says giving a sex offender access to victims of sexual violence is outrageous and dangerous, and says Vera House hasn't done enough to fix this yet. Even though she's calling for change at the very top of Vera House over this week's revelations, we agreed to conceal her identity because of the type of work that she does with young victims.
Yes, I think anyone who knowingly was part of this decision making, there needs to be consequences.
Tonight, as we enter the weekend, we're hearing in no uncertain terms that there are many people in the community who are upset that Vera House hired Marcus Jackson and upset that he counseled victims of sexual trauma in any way. The agency itself admits survivors are contacting staff there to say they are hurt, disappointed, and confused by what's been revealed this week. The co-executive director, who heaped praise on Jackson on Tuesday, said in a statement on Thursday explaining Vera House policy moving forward that, quote, "We commit to work diligently to repair trust and move forward in a manner that honors our work, values, and ultimately all of who we serve."